Vielen Dank. Es ist mir eine große Freude, hier zu sein. It's definitely a great pleasure to be here. Maybe two words in advance. One, the First World War in the moment is a huge topic in Europe, in the newspapers, in TV, and in the discussion of the historical field. It's definitely the main topic in the moment. And the second, I'm very much from the German tradition, and my topics are deeply Germanic, and so I think in the German tradition, the translation is from a young, excellent scholar, but he was on honeymoon going to Oxford during the translation, so I hope that the whole text is perfectly well done. It's always difficult to think in two different intellectual cultures. The main topic is like in the title, the ambiguity of the good, German professors and the war of the minds. The German scholars' attitude toward the Great War has usually been the object of much criticism. Most historians specifically stress the part the professors played in mobilizing the nation and in conveying xenophobic topic. To name but one example, Kurt Flasch, philosopher and historian who taught in Bochum, observed a rabid nationalism and a considerable collection of anti-Western resentments among the German professors. This, however, is a somewhat broad-brush assessment that not only fails to acknowledge the international dimension of the propaganda war, but also misconceives the way the protagonists saw themselves. Furthermore, a lopsided condemnation of the once so very common metaphysics of Germanness, difficult to translate, Deutschtumsmetaphysik, would only serve to petrify contemporary prejudices or to perpetuate them under reserved preconditions. This paper intends to call into question the established view of the war of the minds and advocates a widely contextualized approach analyzing these phenomena within the history of ideas. This seems especially advisable since during war times the scholars did not adhere to meticulously crafted arguments but tended to resort to rallying cries and grave stylizations. Accordingly, we historians find ourselves in the difficult position of having to devise hermeneutics for a group of texts that in their hermeticism seem to almost actively resist any straightforward interpretation. Hence, it's all the more important to elucidate the reception history. Before we are able to assess the actual effect of this World War literature, at least to a reasonable degree, we need to acquire detailed knowledge on print runs, censorship, and distribution area. Today, I would like to deal with three texts that are seen as the epitome of nationalistic bigotry. Firstly, there's Ernst Lissau's Hymn of Hate against England, der Hassgesang gegen England. At first glance, there is no denying its aggressive rhetoric or its widespread impact. Secondly, I shall analyze the Manifesto of the 93, signed by distinguished serious scientists and writers. The text had been intended to evoke international sympathy, but was immediately considered an expression of Germany's overestimation of itself. Thirdly, I will look through Werner Sombert's pamphlet merchants and heroes, more typical German language, Händler und Helden, that more than any other text shapes today's view of German professorial war literature. Finally, I shall pose the question of what price we are actually paying for our clear-cut picture of the war of the minds, and I will outline ways of overcoming it. Ernst Listau, author of The Hymn of Fate Against England, was part of the assimilated German Jew. His father, Hugo Lissauer, died in 1910 as a rich silk merchant in Berlin. He was a well-respected man and led the proud title Kommerzienrat. Like many other members of his generation, Ernst Lissauer, born in 1882, took advantage of his father's property to follow his own intellectual interest. He became a famous lyricist. However, in contrast to many of his contemporaries, he possessed a very conservative worldview and saw in the preservation of German culture an indispensable condition for a prosperous future. Moreover, he proposed strongly in the large Jewish debate of 1912 that the Jews had to go up in the German nation. I quote, "Only two things are possible, either to emigrate or to be German. But then, dig, take root with all strength, with all veins, with all the muscles, educate yourself to become German. Make the German case a case of your own." I guess this is very impressive in the German language. Nur zweierlei ist möglich. Entweder auswandern oder Deutsch werden. Dann aber sich eingraben, einwurzeln mit aller Kraft, mit allen Adern, allen Muskeln, sich zum Deutschen erziehen, die Sache der Deutschen zu der eigenen machen. As might be expected in August 1914, Lissau identified himself with the German nation, which he saw surrounded by envious enemies. Britain's entry into the war in 1914 on the side of the Entente he regarded as unforgivable betrayal and as an attack to the highest cultural values embodied by Germany. In September 1914, right after it had been published somewhat out of the way, that Hymn of Fate Against England met with great public interest. The ponderous poem was regarded as an authentic expression of German indignation over Great Britain's treasonable behavior of the outbreak of war. Its most famous lines may serve to illustrate the paramount importance of its ideological message, as well as its uninspiring poetry. I quote Lissauer, "We will never forgo our hate. We have all but a single hate. We love as one, we hate as one. We have one through and one alone, England." Oh, also this is in German language very impressive. Wir wollen nicht lassen von unserem Hass. Wir haben alle nur einen Hass. Wir lieben vereint, wir hassen vereint. Wir haben alle nur einen Feind, England. After all, with his poem, Lissauer had expressed a widespread attitude in Germany. In his World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig even talks of the Hymn of Hatred as a bomb which had fallen into an ammunition depot. This might be an exaggeration, but it's undeniable that the poem of Lissauer very quickly gained enormous popularity. Admired by the Emperor, the Hymn of Hate shaped life at the home front, and the greeting, "May God punish England," Gott straf England, answered by, "So be it," strafe es, could be heard at many a street corner during the first month of the war. The people just went in the morning to buy some bread and they said, Gott strafe England. Nothing much changed when it came to light that the author was an assimilated Berlin Jew. The emperor awarded Lissauer the Order of the Red Eagle with ribbon, and together with the Crown Prince of Bavaria, he ensured that the poem was widely circulated within the military. The Pan-German stream of spiteful invective against Lissau's Jewishness, however, played only a minor role. Nevertheless, the hymn of hate failed to have a lasting effect. This was largely due to the German Bildungsbürgertum, the academic middle classes, whose views and attitudes basically constituted public opinion. The Bildungsbürgertum firmly believed that the Central Powers were leading a war for human ideals, and hence, as a matter of principle, it disapproved of demonizing the military enemy. Influential Jewish intellectuals went even a step further. The journalist Benjamin Segel interviewed 60 opinion leaders among German Jews, and nearly one of them regarded the hymn of hate as geniusly Jewish. It was common ground that universal ethical values were of higher importance than vilifying the major enemy, which England was doubtlessly considered to be. While the war continued, Lissauer soon found himself among the undesirables, because his patriotic poetry allegedly denied the chivalrous character of German culture. This was a remarkable one-sided appraisal of matters. Its effect not only equal to an ostracism, but also grist for the anti-Semites' mill. But it supplied a scapegoat for the disastrous image of Germany among the Entente powers that was considered to be in need of an explanation. Lissauer also became the victim of an anti-Semite smear campaign because his extreme nationalistic political thoughts were quite uncommon among liberal German Jews. Most members of the educated middle classes preferred an idealistic understanding of German culture as it was cultivated in schools and universities. Exactly how highly the German Bildungsbürgertum thought of itself can be gleaned from the Appeal to the Cultural World, published on October the 4th, 1940. Its signatories, all 93 of them eminent intellectuals, had hoped to promote the German cause. Part 2. Employing a prose consciously reminiscent of Luther's thesis, the manifesto of the 93 confronted Allied propaganda. William II was no Attila, but a Prince of Peace, who in his reign over now 26 years had time and again proven his fair-mindedness. Claims of war crimes committed in Belgium were unwarranted. Its neutrality had to be sacrificed for the sake of the German nation's right to live. German militarism, moreover, was an honorary title. Without it, German civilization would long since have been extirpated. In contrast, the deceitfulness of England and France was clearly visible, considering that they had allied themselves with unjust states, such as Russia and Serbia, and they were inciting the indigenous people of their colonies against the white race. Because of the manifesto's drastic dictions, Historians have for a long time held the nationalistic right responsible for it. Fritz Fischer deemed Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, the author, Prussian nobleman and conservative racist. In actual fact, however, the world-famous Berlin professor had merely adorned the manifesto with a signature. Its origin can be pinpointed into the liberal left that at the turn of the century had so vehemently opposed the emperor's backward cultural policy. Ludwig Fulda, chairman of the Berlin Goethe Federation, had written the first draft, and Hermann Sudermann, a nationalistic writer, contributed several key arguments. Some artists like the painter Max Liebermann or the writer Gerhard Hauptmann, who had been famous in Germany for decades, signed the manifesto. Even more remarkable was its resonance among Germany's scholars. In the humanities, a lot of well-respected professors signed the manifesto. Besides the famous theologian and president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, the future Max Planck Gesellschaft, Adolf von Harnack. The philosophers Rudolf Eucken, Wilhelm Windelband and Max Wundt were among the signatories, as well as the economist Luigi Brentano and Gustav Schmoller. Even the scientists were not restrained. Together with the Marburgian professor Emil von Behring, the first winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1901, some world-famous scholars like Paul Ehrlich, Fritz Haber, Emil Fischer or Konrad Röntgen gave their signature. All of them gained the Nobel Prize. Fritz Haber, although he was accused by the Entente States to be the main responsible scholar for the use of poison gas in the war, at last in 1980. A pacifist view like Albert Einstein's was not very common in the academic world. The confession was widespread that it was the duty of everybody to defend the homeland in case of emergency. Most of the professors who had signed the manifesto of the 93 were politically not conservative, but were generally sympathetic either to the liberal left or the national liberal parties. There's no doubt at their willingness to stand up to their country, but they had not wasted a single thought on the preconditions of successful propaganda. Immediately, the manifesto was translated into 10 languages, but given the strength of the German military apparatus, its impact was disastrous. Within the Entente and the neutral states, it seemed inconceivable how scholars far away from the front lines would know everything noteworthy about atrocities committed by the German army in Belgium. The manifesto's tone of voice was considered presumptuous. This especially applied to the airliness the authors exhibited when citing the legacy of Goethe, a Beethoven and a Kant to vindicate current events. Criticizing these philosophical embellishments of political interest was instantly plausible and still meets with approval today. Without adequate interpretation of historical circumstances, however, this criticism threatens to obscure significant dimensions of the measure of events. The aggressive character as well as the professionalization of Allied propaganda were both crucial stimulants for the scholarly over-identification with German culture. There is, for one, Henri Bergson's powerfully eloquent statement of August VIII. He glorified the inner unity of the French nation and called for arms for a battle of civilization against barbarism. Furthermore, there's the British press stylizing the Germans as Huns. The Times, until then rather Germanophile, particularly favored this second stereotype, and it also proved very suitable for visualizations. Even today, it still has lost nothing of its potency. The German professors and their anti-British propaganda failed to achieve a similar success. However, this does not mean that one should think of a special path in German history of ideas, im deutschen Sonderweg, in der Ideengeschichte. This position neglects the fact that the propaganda war was an international event. It was important to refute the opposing arguments and to advertise the own view. Moreover, the idea of a special path in German history, of the famous German Sonderweg, favored precisely those glorifications of a German character which the idea itself tries to damage. At last, this leads to both assumptions of continuity, which to substantiate empirically is nearly impossible. Sometimes they try to show a direct connection between the War of Mines and the guerrilla war and the Eastern Front since 1941. But even the history of ideas during World War I deserved to be understood by her own preconditions. How much people in Germany tried to learn from the Allied propaganda can be demonstrated by Werner Sombart, who was one of the most read social scientists at his time. And now the third and last part, to the most famous book in Germany about the First World War. In February 1915, it was Werner Sombart who adopted an unaccommodating tone of voice in his book, Merchants and Heroes. The Economist, ingenious when it came to self-marketing, had realized that drastic simplification was the single most effective weapon in the overheating debates of the Great War. Accordingly, he decided for a palette of black and white, depicting the English as greedy merchants who had to be put in place by the brave Germans. He savagely argued against the confusion of war and sports and contrasted an atomized British society with a socially minded German community. Sombart's book served primarily ideological rearmament. It should show young German soldiers the direction when all future, the enemy of German character, should be searched. According to that, the pictures used to characterize the enemy were very drastic. England is described as a giant octopus trying to strengthen the world. In the long run, however, it would be impossible for English merchants to advertise their ideal of a comfortable life. Most people would assess a pure utilitarian understanding of human culture as far too superficial. The future, however, would belong to the heroic man, who would not shrink away from a life more dangerous and who was deeply rooted within his own people, his German folk. To this day, Sombart's book is regarded an exemplar of German academic chauvinism, and its success is emphasized time and again. As it happens, the Salon Marxist had first and foremost disgruntled his colleagues who were offended by his unscrupulous use of ressentiments. The liberal left was steadfast in its Anglophilia, and so his prejudiced examples would not hold. In Weimar, however, where Elisabeth Förder Nietzsche was busy marketing her late brother as a national hero, Sommer's ideas and arguments aroused great interest. A debasement of British civilization matched her own agenda and gave her the opportunity to push forward Nietzsche's patriotism. Nietzsche had, after all, called her brother the last bard and seer of the German people, and had emphatically underlined his military attitude. However, the contradiction against the political use of Nietzsche was violent. First of all, it came from expressionist writers whose enemies liked to call them Kaffeehausliterar. This can be demonstrated by an article of Franz Pfemfert, which argued against the occupation of Nietzsche as pure German. Gegen die Deutschsprechung Nietzsches, like Heiligsprechung Nietzsches, by his sister. Till today, this text is used to illustrate the change of the reception of Nietzsche during World War I. But one should avoid any exaggeration. Elizabeth further Nietzsche's decision would be fundamental for the political orientation of the Nietzsche Archive. But this should not hide the fact that radical ideas such as these were hardly acceptable for the majority of German academia. In view of an inconceivable number of war victims, it was, in the end, all about sense making. Only those who were easily able to construe historic continuity seemed to know the way into a better future. For that reason, brusque comments and attitudes were far less in demand than is widely believed among historians. Moreover, we should not underestimate the human need for stability. Nationalistic concepts, in particular, had to vouch for the perpetuity of a world whose dissolution was suspected but could not be faced. On these grounds, clap speakers like Rudolf Eucken, a neo-idealist from Jena, emerged as key figures in the War of the Minds. In thinking of this Nobel laureate, Luther, Kant, and Fichte became the forefathers of German philosophy, whose humanist ideas were vastly superior to an unleashed modernity. The significance of this intellectual tradition led him to conclude that the fortunes of war would be with Germany. This does not mean, however, that Eucken's high regard for German culture would evoke sympathy in the Western world, and even less was it universally shared. Quite the contrary. The heroes of German intellectual tradition were being disliked emphatically. Especially Kant, seen as the advocate of a strict sense of duty among the military, or Fichte, seen as the presumptuous prophet of his own people, met for the most part with an almost categorical refusal. The American pragmatist John Dewey argued, for instance, that there was a tight link between the all-too-daring ego-philosophy of German idealism and the Central Power's excessive aims of war. His claims are, of course, unfounded and would not withstand a serious academic debate, but they clearly illustrate how allegiance and reproaches were being exchanged in the War of Minds, and how heated it actually was. German academia had wrongly relied on its own goodwill. Under the conditions of a propaganda war, Kant's concept only served to substantiate one's own claims or to obscure the political situation. Goodwill, as the legitimizing principle of normative ethics, was an idea that had ceased to convince, and by 1918 at the latest, it had become obsolete. To conclude, I would like to sum up with some results. We are paying a high price for our clear-cut picture of the war of the minds. We are repeating, albeit critically, nationalistic top oil, and in doing so, we are contributed, albeit unintentionally, to their continued existence. At the same time, we are underestimating the contextual character of world war literature. Only at first glance do they appear to utter convictions that are set in stone. By being very aware of censorship and its prime objective of upholding the civic truth, the authors still wanted to influence domestic politics. Before we are able to properly understand these writings, we have to decipher camouflaged commands and ideologically charged expressions. To my mind, two things are crucial for a better understanding of world war literature. Firstly, we should pay more attention to ambiguities. For example, it's neither widely known nor satisfactorily explained why Stuart Chamberlain was the most read German propaganda writer. He sold more than 1 million books. His contacts with the imperial court were certainly advantageous, as well as the professionalism of his publisher Bruckmann in Munich. But the pivotal point was a different one. Richard Wagner's son-in-law simply had more to offer to his readers than Eucken with his glorification of Protestant tradition of Bildung, or Sombart with his England bashing garnished with a touch of cultural pessimism. When describing the British spirit of the merchandise, Chamberlain used a large tinted with anti-Semitism, which evaded censorship but was easily understood by the extremist right. At the same time, he boldly ignored all facts that contradicted his philosophy of history and thus ensured its attractiveness, which is peculiar to self-contained views of the world in a time of crisis. Secondly, and maybe most important, we should pay more attention to the discursive dynamics of this unforgiving propaganda war. Having resorted to cause nationalist drumming in the first place, the intellectuals were left with little room for maneuver later on. Accordingly, a history of ideas, too, needs to analyze the intrinsic logics that were formative to the Great War. To name but one example, the defiant commitment to the German militarism fueled a disastrous stereotype and moreover aided and abetted a distortion of Germany's past. It shows, if nothing else, how careful one should be when dealing with nationalistic prejudices. This is valid down to the present day. Thank you very much.